What happens when a wealthy man disguises himself as a homeless person to test his family's loyalty? The shocking truth will leave you questioning the bonds of love and trust. It began on a quiet evening, long after the world had assumed everything was perfect in the life of Richard Moore, a name that carried weight, power, and influence. He lived in a mansion, owned several companies, and had a family most people envied: his beautiful wife Sarah, his ambitious son David, and his free-spirited daughter Emily. From the outside, Richard's life was flawless. But Richard knew better. For years, a nagging doubt had crept into his mind, a doubt that refused to fade. Was it his wealth that held his family together, or something deeper? Were the smiles genuine, or were they just masks, worn to secure a place in his fortune? Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the people closest to him might not be as loyal as they seemed. So, he made a decision, one that would change everything. He would test them, not through questions or conversations, but in a way that would leave no room for pretense. Richard decided to disappear, not physically, but in a way that would strip him of everything that made him recognizable. He would become invisible to them. A few days later, he set his plan in motion. His trusted business partner took over his affairs under the guise that Richard was on an extended business trip. In reality, he wasn't going anywhere. He was going to stay right there, right in their midst, but in a form they would never expect. Richard traded his tailored suits for tattered clothes. His clean-shaven face was overtaken by an unruly beard. His well-groomed hair became tangled, unwashed. In a matter of days, the man who had commanded boardrooms and shaken hands with dignitaries was transformed into someone nobody would look twice at, a homeless man. But this was no simple disguise. This was a test of loyalty, of love, of humanity. Richard knew exactly where he needed to be. Every morning, David walked to his high-rise office downtown, past the same intersection. Sarah spent her afternoons at the exclusive cafe, where she met with friends to talk about the latest fashions. Emily often wandered through the park on her way to her art classes. Richard positioned himself carefully, always staying just within view but never too close. He wanted to see, truly see, how they would react when they didn't know it was him. Days passed, and with each passing moment, Richard's heart grew heavier. David rushed by him on the first day, his phone glued to his ear, never sparing a glance at the man sitting by the street. There was no recognition in his eyes, no pause, no curiosity, just indifference. The same indifference he likely showed to every other person struggling on the streets. Then came Sarah, dressed impeccably as always. She was preoccupied, flipping through her phone as she sipped her coffee outside the cafe. Richard sat just across the street, waiting, hoping for a moment of acknowledgement. But none came. She didn't look up. She didn't see him. And so, it went. Each day, Richard observed his family from a distance, their lives continuing as usual, while his world grew darker, colder. What had once been a bold experiment was quickly turning into a painful revelation. Was this all he was to them? A source of wealth and comfort? Without his power, his money, his image, was he nothing? As the days dragged on, Richard's doubts about his family deepened, but he wasn't done yet. He needed to know how far this indifference went. His heart braced for the answers that would come next, even though they might be far worse than anything he had imagined. The test had only just begun. The transformation was complete. Richard Moore, the powerful businessman, no longer existed. In his place sat a homeless man, forgotten by society, invisible to the world that used to bow at his feet. His once pristine hands, now dirt-covered, held an old coffee cup, rattling with spare change from strangers who passed by without a second thought. It wasn't just his appearance that had changed. He had stripped away everything that made him recognizable, his dignity, his confidence, even the way he walked and spoke. The man who once commanded attention with a single glance now hunched over on a bench, blending into the backdrop of the city. But this wasn't just any city. This was his city. The streets he had once driven through in his luxury cars now seemed foreign, even hostile. Every corner held memories of power, but now he wandered those very streets as a ghost. The experiment continued. Richard's spot was carefully chosen, right in the heart of his family's routine, yet far enough away that they wouldn't think twice about him. It was early morning when David walked by for the first time. Richard hadn't seen his son in days, and his heart raced at the sight of him. David strode down the street, dressed in his usual sharp business attire, carrying a leather briefcase. His jaw was set with determination, and his pace was brisk, so much like Richard's had once been. But as his son neared, Richard felt an odd sensation, a flicker of hope. Would David stop? Would he recognize him, even in this disguise? Or at least spare a moment to acknowledge the man on the street? The answer came in an instant. David passed by without so much as a glance. His eyes were fixed on his phone, his mind somewhere else entirely. To him, the homeless man sitting on the bench didn't even exist. Richard watched him disappear into the distance, his heart heavy with disappointment. Was this who his son had become? Someone too consumed by ambition to notice the world around him? But Richard wasn't done yet. He still had to test the others. Later that day, it was Sarah's turn. Richard positioned himself across the street from the cafe she frequented, watching as she arrived in her expensive car, stepping out gracefully in her designer dress. She was meeting friends, as she often did, a group of women who lived lives as insulated as her own. Richard watched as she took her usual seat at the outdoor table, chatting and laughing without a care in the world. For a moment, he hesitated. Did he really want to go through with this? To see if his own wife could walk past him without so much as a flicker of recognition. But he had to know. He had to know the truth. So, he waited. Minutes passed, and Sarah's laughter filled the air. Richard's heart tightened with every second, waiting for her to glance his way, to see the man sitting just a few steps from her. But nothing. Her eyes never wandered in his direction. She was too engrossed in the world of her own privilege to notice the suffering that lay so close. As the day faded, so did Richard's hope. His family, the people he had spent his life providing for, seemed blind to him. They walked past him as if he were just another shadow on the street. He wasn't their father, husband or provider. He was no one, just a nameless face in a sea of forgotten souls. But there was one more test to be done. Emily, his daughter, was always the most unpredictable. Kind-hearted and free-spirited, she had always been the one Richard had hoped would see past the material world. She had been the one who talked about empathy, about the importance of helping others. If anyone would recognize him, if anyone would show compassion, it would be her. And so, Richard waited again. He knew Emily's routine. She often passed through the park on her way to her art class. It was her favorite place, filled with inspiration, with people from all walks of life. As the sun set, Emily appeared. She walked slowly, lost in thought, her headphones on and her sketchbook in hand. Richard's heart pounded as she approached. Would she stop? Would she at least glance his way? For a moment, it seemed like she might. She slowed down, her eyes landing briefly on the homeless figure sitting on the bench. There was a flicker of recognition. Or was it pity? She hesitated, reaching into her bag as if she was about to offer him something. But just as quickly, she pulled her hand back and kept walking. Richard sat frozen, the weight of that moment pressing down on him. His own daughter had seen him, yet turned away. She had almost offered kindness, but something held her back. Was it doubt? Was it fear? The test was almost complete, but the results so far were shattering. Richard was no longer a man of wealth and influence. He was nothing more than a ghost, unseen by the very people who should have loved him the most. But the most painful truth was still waiting to be revealed. Richard's days on the streets blurred together, each one more painful than the last. His disguise was no longer just a test. It had become a brutal reality. The man who had once commanded attention was now ignored, not only by strangers, but by his own flesh and blood. The rejection weighed on him, yet there was still one question left to answer. How far did their indifference go? His mind replayed the moments over and over. David's hurried walk past him, Sarah's carefree laughter at the cafe, Emily's brief hesitation but ultimate decision to keep moving. Each encounter felt like a small betrayal, building up to something larger, something undeniable. But Richard needed to be sure. He had to push the limits. And so, he decided to take the test further. One evening, he positioned himself outside the restaurant where Sarah and David were meeting for dinner. It wasn't unusual for them to dine together, discussing business, family affairs, and occasionally his health. Richard wanted to see if, when they were together, they would notice him, if two pairs of eyes were more likely to catch a glimpse of the man they had once known. Dressed in the same ragged clothes, Richard sat just outside the entrance, his head low, a cup at his feet. The cool evening air carried the scent of food, but it only deepened the hollow feeling in his stomach. He had eaten little since beginning this experiment, partly out of necessity, partly out of guilt. The comfort of his old life now seemed so far away. As the dinner rush began, Sarah and David arrived, stepping out of their cars with a sense of importance that Richard now found foreign. They entered the restaurant, laughing as they exchanged stories about their day. Richard watched them disappear through the doors without a single glance in his direction. Hours passed as he waited outside. People came and went, a few tossing coins into his cup, others walking past without a second thought. But the door of the restaurant finally opened, and out came Sarah and David, still deep in conversation. For a moment, Richard almost stood up, almost called out to them. But he stopped himself. This was the final test. Would they notice him in the crowd? Would they recognize the man who had once been the center of their lives? David looked down briefly, his eyes scanning the street for a cab, while Sarah continued to chat, completely unaware of the world around her. Richard sat there, hoping, praying that maybe, just maybe, one of them would stop. But neither did. They walked past him, once again, without so much as a flicker of recognition. The weight of the realization settled in his chest. His son and wife had become so consumed by their lives, by the luxury, the money, the superficial comforts, that they couldn't even see him anymore. They were blind to everything that didn't directly serve their needs. But there was still one more person, Emily. She had hesitated once before, but that hesitation had stayed with Richard. It had given him a sliver of hope, a belief that perhaps she was different, that maybe, somewhere inside, she still carried the kindness she had once been known for. He had to know for sure. A few days later, he found himself sitting near Emily's favorite spot in the park. She often spent her afternoons there, drawing or reading, away from the rush of the city. Richard waited, his heart heavy but determined. If Emily recognized him now, if she stopped to offer any form of help, it might change everything. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Emily appeared. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the scene around her, lost in thought as always. Richard's pulse quickened as she neared. This was it, the moment of truth. Emily approached, and this time she did stop. She looked directly at him, her eyes searching his face. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. Was it possible? Could she see through the disguise, through the dirt and grime? For a second, He thought he saw a flash of recognition in her eyes, but it quickly faded. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a note of concern. Richard nodded, unable to speak. His throat tightened, and for a moment he felt tears welling up, but he held them back. Emily hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a few bills. She bent down and placed them in his cup. "Take care of yourself, okay?" she whispered, her eyes lingering on him for just a moment longer before she turned and walked away. Richard stared at the crumpled bills in the cup, his heart sinking. She had noticed him, yes, but only as another homeless man in need of help, not as her father, not as the man who had raised her, who had loved her. She had shown compassion, but not the kind that came from true recognition or loyalty. The realization hit him harder than anything else. His family had failed his test, not just once, but repeatedly. They had passed by him, offered nothing more than pity or indifference, and continued on with their lives. The people he had built his life around had shown him that, without his wealth and status, he was invisible to them. The test was over. But the hardest part was yet to come. Richard sat alone that evening, his mind heavy with the weight of his experiment. The park had grown quiet, the usual hustle of city life fading into the distant hum of evening traffic. Emily's soft words echoed in his mind. "Take care of yourself." Kind, yes, but hollow. She hadn't recognized him. None of them had. He was a stranger in their world now, an invisible figure they barely noticed, much less cared about. But just as he was about to sink deeper into despair, something unexpected happened. A familiar voice broke through the quiet. "Richard, is that really you?" Startled, Richard looked up. Standing before him was someone he hadn't seen in years. Tom, an old friend from his younger days, back when neither of them had much to their name. Tom had fallen on hard times after a series of bad investments and a divorce that left him with little more than the clothes on his back. Richard hadn't thought about Tom in ages, but here he was, standing in front of him with eyes that saw through the disguise. "I'd know you anywhere, man," Tom said, his voice filled with surprise, but also concern. "What in the world are you doing out here like this?" Richard's throat tightened. The honesty of the moment was overwhelming. Here was someone from his past, someone who had no reason to care about his current wealth or status, seeing him in his most vulnerable state and recognizing him immediately. He struggled to find the words. "It's complicated," Richard muttered, his voice barely audible. He looked away, ashamed. For the first time in this entire experiment, he felt truly exposed. Tom, of all people, had found him like this. And now, Richard had to face the reality he had been avoiding. Tom, without hesitation, sat down next to Richard on the cold bench. "Doesn't matter what's going on, Rich. You shouldn't be out here like this. Come on, let me help you." The offer was simple, genuine, and completely unexpected. Tom didn't ask why Richard was sitting there in rags, didn't press for explanations. He just extended a hand Richard hadn't expected from anyone, least of all from someone who had once been forgotten in the shadows of his life. For a moment Richard was speechless. After everything he had been through in the last few weeks, after being ignored by his own family, the kindness of an old friend hit him harder than any of the rejections he had faced. This wasn't about charity, this was about loyalty, real loyalty. Richard hesitated, his pride fighting against his instincts. But then, he realized, this was the very thing he had been searching for all along. Not from his family, not from those who had enjoyed the benefits of his success, but from someone who cared for him without conditions, without expectations. He looked at Tom, his voice thick with emotion. "Why are you helping me, Tom? After all these years?" Tom shrugged, his face softening with a genuine smile. "We've all been through hard times, Rich. It doesn't matter how much money you've got or who you know. At the end of the day, we're all just people, and we've got to look out for each other." Richard sat in silence, the weight of Tom's words settling into him like a heavy truth. It was simple, yet profound. In all his wealth and success, he had forgotten that the most valuable thing a person could have wasn't money, but loyalty, real, honest loyalty. And it didn't come from those who stood beside you when times were good. It came from those who stayed when everything else was gone. For the first time in days, Richard felt a sense of clarity. The test hadn't been a failure. In fact, it had revealed more than he had expected. It had shown him the truth, not just about his family, but about himself and the world he had built around him. He accepted Tom's offer. Together, they walked to a small diner nearby where Tom bought him a hot meal and listened as Richard, for the first time, opened up about what he had been doing. The disguise, the experiment, the painful revelations about his family. Tom listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully as Richard spoke. After a long pause, Tom finally said, "You know, you can't change what people do when they think no one's watching. But you can change what you do with that knowledge. Maybe it's time for you to decide what kind of life you really want from here on out." Richard nodded, the truth of those words sinking deep into his heart. He realized that the power he thought he had held, the power of wealth and status, was nothing compared to the power of understanding who truly cared about him without any strings attached. The night ended with Richard feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks, hope, but he knew the hardest part was still to come. He couldn't avoid the confrontation with his family any longer. The test had revealed their true nature, but it was up to him to decide what would happen next. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Richard prepared himself for what was to come. The time had come to confront his family, to reveal the truth, and to face the consequences of the loyalty test. But nothing could prepare them, or Richard, for what would happen next. Richard stood outside his home. The house that once felt like a fortress of comfort and security now felt distant, almost unfamiliar. The sprawling mansion, with its perfectly manicured lawns and grand entrance, no longer held the same meaning. It was just a shell, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life. He wasn't coming home as the man who had left. He was returning with the truth, a truth that would shatter the illusion his family had been living under. The time had come to reveal it all. Inside, his family was gathered, oblivious to what was about to unfold. His wife, Sarah, was seated in the living room, flipping through magazines as if nothing was amiss. David was on his laptop, engrossed in work, and Emily was sketching quietly by the window. They didn't expect him. To them, Richard had been away on business, his absence barely noticed. Richard entered quietly, his heart racing. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, watching them live their lives as if nothing had changed. But everything had. He stepped forward, and the sound of his footsteps drew their attention. They all looked up, surprised to see him standing there. No longer the businessman they were used to, but something different. Someone changed. "Richard, you're home early," Sarah said, her voice casual, not suspecting the weight of what was about to come. "I am," Richard replied, his voice steady, though inside he was anything but calm. "But I'm not the same man who left." David raised an eyebrow, sensing something serious. "What's going on, Dad?" Richard took a deep breath, then began. "I need to tell you all the truth. The past few weeks I wasn't on a business trip. I wasn't even away. I've been right here, watching you, testing you. I disguised myself as a homeless man to see how you would treat someone who had nothing." A stunned silence fell over the room. Sarah's magazine slipped from her hands, David's fingers paused over the keys of his laptop, and Emily's sketchbook fell onto the floor. They all stared at Richard, disbelief and confusion etched on their faces. "I needed to know," Richard continued. "If any of you cared about me beyond the money, beyond the comfort, I needed to see if your loyalty was real, and now I know." Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. "Richard, what are you talking about? You did this to test us." Richard nodded, his eyes heavy with sadness. "Yes, I sat on the street right in front of you and none of you recognized me, not once." David stood up, anger flashing in his eyes. "You can't be serious. You're telling us that this was some kind of game, a test. How could you do that to us?" But Richard wasn't swayed by the anger. It wasn't a game. It was the only way to know the truth, and the truth is, none of you saw me. You all walked past me, just like I was any other homeless man. I was invisible to you. Emily's eyes welled up with tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I gave you money. I thought I was helping." Richard's heart softened for a moment as he looked at his daughter. "You did, Emily. You showed me kindness, but you didn't recognize me. You didn't see me for who I am. You saw what I had become, and that's the problem. All of you, you only see what's on the surface. You only care about the wealth, the status, not me." Sarah stood up, her voice defensive, shaky. "That's not true, Richard. We love you. We just didn't know it was you." Richard shook his head, the sadness in his eyes deepening. "That's the point, Sarah. You didn't know it was me because you never looked. You were too wrapped up in your own lives to see me, even when I was right in front of you." The room fell silent again, the weight of Richard's words sinking in. Each of them realized in their own way the truth he was revealing. They had failed him. Not because they hadn't given him money or pity, but because they hadn't cared enough to see him, to truly see him. And then Richard dropped the final blow, the secret that would change everything. "I've made a decision," he said, his voice firm, but tinged with a quiet resolve. "I'm going to leave most of my fortune to charity, the people who actually need help, and the rest to the one person who showed me real loyalty." Sarah's face went pale. "What? You can't be serious, Richard. You're going to give away everything we've built." David's fists clenched at his sides. "Dad, this isn't fair. You can't just throw everything away." But Richard didn't falter. "It's already done. Tom, the man who helped me when I was out on the streets, is getting what remains of my estate. He showed me more kindness and loyalty in a single moment than I've seen in this house in years." Emily sobbed quietly, her head bowed in shame. Sarah and David stood in shock, their world crumbling around them. "I've spent my life building this family, thinking I was doing the right thing by giving you all the best, but I realize now that I failed. I gave you everything except the one thing that matters most: love without conditions, loyalty without money involved. And now I have to live with that." With that, Richard turned and walked out of the house, leaving his family in stunned silence. The weight of his words hung in the air like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over everything they had believed. As Richard walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had tested his family, and while the results had been painful, they had given him clarity. The man who had once defined himself by his wealth had found something far more valuable: the truth. And sometimes the truth was the only thing worth holding on to.